Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the Fugitive Slave Act and the way that it backfires on the South. This is the beginning of our unit where we're talking about the breakdown of relations between the North and the South. And so that's what you should be thinking about as you watch this video. How did all of this stuff help to lead to conflict between the Northern Free States and the Southern Slave States? Here are your goals. Okay, so the background to this whole fiasco with the Fugitive Slave Act is the Compromise of 1850. And you guys probably remember this, but we'll go over it again just as a refresher. The Compromise of 1850 was intended to keep the North and the South together by giving both sides some stuff that they wanted. The North got California as a free state, which was their main goal. And originally, the South was so upset by this that a lot of Southerners threatened to leave the country if California was allowed to become a free state, because it would tip the balance of power in the Senate and give the North more votes than the South. But because of the Compromise of 1850, the North gave the South some stuff, and this kept the South from breaking away and prevented the war from starting. So what did the South get in exchange for the North getting California? Well, the two things that the South got were the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically said that they were allowed to go and get runaway slaves from the North and bring them back to the South. And it also opened Utah and New Mexico to slavery, even though a lot of people thought that slavery would never catch on there because it was mostly mountains and desert and didn't have the right type of soil for plantations. Many Southerners viewed the Compromise of 1850 as a bad deal for the South, and they saw the Fugitive Slave Act as basically the only good part of the deal. So let's talk a little bit more about what the Fugitive Slave Act actually said and why it was so important to the South. The Fugitive Slave Act was basically a countermeasure to the Underground Railroad. So as we learned a few chapters ago, the Underground Railroad was organized by Northern and Southern abolitionists, and it was a series of safe houses that helped lead eventually thousands of escaped slaves to the North, where then they could live in freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act was designed to counteract this by allowing Southern slave hunters to go up to the North and to recapture escaped slaves. And basically what would happen is Southern slave owners would pay henchmen to go up north, and they would give them a description of the runaway slave and where they thought they were, and then the henchmen would arrest these runaway slaves and take them back south for slavery. And this was problematic for a couple reasons, but the biggest problem was that there was no way to make sure that the slave hunters were actually taking the correct person. Like, how did they know that they weren't just kidnapping some entirely different person than the slave that they were paid to capture and return south? There was no trial. And so a lot of people thought that this was illegitimate and that this basically was just kidnapping. So to put it very plainly, the North hated the Fugitive Slave Act, and they started to resist the Fugitive Slave Act basically as soon as it went into effect. Many Northerners viewed the Fugitive Slave Act as clearly wrong, and they refused to cooperate with it. Basically, they viewed it as one thing if the South wanted to do slavery down on its own territory, but they viewed it as something entirely different if the South was going to come up and start taking slaves from northern soil. People could not stand this, and many northern cities began to oppose the Fugitive Slave Act. On top of this, lots of people in these areas started to move towards the ideas of the abolition movement. Basically, they started to think that slavery was wrong and that it should be abolished, aka gotten rid of. And so as a result of this, you start to see protests in the northern cities against the Fugitive Slave Act. For the first couple times that kidnappers came up to Boston, the people of Boston defended the escaped slaves and blocked the kidnappers. Basically, they formed little militias and prevented the kidnappers from taking anybody away from Boston. And on top of this, Massachusetts actually passed laws to block the Fugitive Slave Act in Massachusetts. And so what this meant is that the federal government had to come in and use the army to enforce this law. And this makes the Whig Party look really bad. And this is problematic because the Whig Party was popular in the North up until this time, and the Whig Party favored compromise with the South. But now the Whig Party is going to start to lose favor, and the North is going to move away from compromise and towards not compromising with the South, which is going to help lead to conflict. So the Fugitive Slave Law had some really important effects, and we need to go over these if we're going to understand why it matters for history. So in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had looked like a victory for the South, but really the law ended up hurting the South in a number of ways. First of all, not really very many slaves were ever captured as a result of the Fugitive Slave Law. In contrast to the millions of slaves who already lived in the South, the small number of slaves taken from the North didn't really matter in the end. And in exchange for these very few slaves who were actually taken from the North, the South lost a lot of the goodwill that was left in the North. Basically, the North now was totally against compromise with the South, and it led to growing abolitionism in the North. A lot of people in the North began to think that compromise with the South was impossible and wrong, and it made the Whig Party look bad. And so all of this helped to lead to the rise of a new anti-slavery party, the Republicans. And the Republicans were totally against compromise with the South. And when the Republicans eventually come to power under Abraham Lincoln in 1860, that is going to be the cause that actually leads to war. So even right after the Compromise of 1850, things are still going wrong. The North and the South can't get along, and we're already seeing the first steps towards conflict and war between the North and the South. And the Fugitive Slave Law played an important part in this. All right, here you goes. Thanks for watching.